Yo, 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 dear listeners, it's your boy Ethan again, the guy who makes grammar fun. And hey, grammar is not grandma. Who said I said that? All right, back to kick things off on Sip and Talk. Man, our thought experiment series is crazy popular. You folks are loving it. Today, we're cranking up the heat with the spicier thought experiment. When the threat's at the door, you gotta fight. How this narrative logic steers the CCP towards its bright future. In this wild ride, we imagine China rising as the global superpower, fueled by the threat at our doorstep and century of humiliation stories, eventually taking down Japan and challenging the West, plunging the world into total chaos. Want to know how it all kicks off? Stick around and keep listening. All right, I'm handing the show back to our hosts. If I get too fired up and my voice sneaks into the background, don't hold it against me, okay? Sonny and Joe, take it away. P.S. Drop your thoughts in the comments, crew.
Today we're tackling something, well, really challenging.
Wow.
It's a bold thought experiment pulled directly from the sources you shared with us.
That's right. It explores this hypothetical future, a tough one, where China takes Taiwan and the U.S. and its allies, kind of surprisingly in this scenario, fail to intervene effectively.
And then China claims it's achieved great rejuvenation, with its tech and power surging because, crucially, it gets control of TSMC.
It's a heavy premise, absolutely. And this experiment, it really forces us to confront some pretty uncomfortable possibilities. Like, what happens after an event like that, a really dramatic shift? What would the world actually look like?
And how would the U.S. and allies scramble to react, you know?
Exactly.
The source material makes it pretty clear this whole scenario is packed with what-ifs. And it definitely stands in stark contrast to the complex reality we see today.
But running the experiment, going through these 4 distinct stages the sources lay out, it helps us unpack potential consequences, even if they're hypothetical.
Our mission here is, well, pretty straightforward. We want to dive into these sources about this specific future scenario and pull out the most critical insights for you, the listener.
Let's do it.
All right, let's unpack this fascinating and maybe disturbing journey. We start with stage 1. The narrative starting point, at the doorstep. So we had no choice but to fight.
Yeah, this whole thought experiment really hinges on adapting a narrative we've seen used recently. The sources talk about China's stance on the Russia-Ukraine war. Officially neutral, sure, but, definitely leaning towards Russia.
And they point out how China deliberately avoids words like invasion, preferring Ukraine crisis.
That's key. And they've really latched onto that core Russian logic, this idea that the West, particularly NATO expansion, pushed Russia into a corner.
Right, the at-the-doorstep idea, leaving them supposedly no choice but to act preemptively for their own security.
Exactly. And what's significant, according to the sources, is how China frames this. It's not just about Russia's right to sovereignty and security. It's presented as a direct anti-U.S. script. It paints the U.S. as the real instigator of the conflict, trying to encircle rivals.
So it makes China and Russia look like they're facing a similar kind of threat from perceived American aggression.
That's the narrative presented. And here's the critical insight the sources highlight. This isn't just commentary on Ukraine. This at-the-doorstep narrative is being deliberately constructed as groundwork. It's about creating discursive legitimacy, a public justification framework for a potential future move on Taiwan.
Okay, wow. So it's like pre-building the excuse.
That's what the sources argue. They mention state media actively pushing the idea that Ukraine was a U.S. proxy war. And the argument is this was a conscious effort to find an international template, a ready-made story that could potentially apply later to Taiwan.
Which brings us to the trigger event in this hypothetical scenario. China claims Taiwan is an internal affair. We hear that all the time. Then, any U.S. or allied support for Taiwan gets labeled at the doorstep, a hostile act forcing China's hand. And then, boom.
A massive military operation is launched, amphibious landings, missile blockades, cyber warfare, the works.
And the scenario makes this crucial and frankly pretty hard to swallow assumption. The U.S. and its allies fail.
Yeah, for whatever reason, misjudgment, disunity, maybe something else, they don't effectively stop the takeover. Taiwan falls quickly.
And then there's that twist with TSMC, the world's top semiconductor maker. It becomes war spoil.
Ah, yes, TSMC. The sources really emphasize this. Gaining control isn't just a win, it's the pivotal event in this hypothetical. It leads to that projected massive surge in China's technology, its economy, its military power.
It's the linchpin, allowing them to claim they've achieved great rejuvenation.
And the global aftermath. The sources describe it as a shock wave.
In the United States, it's compared to 9/11, a profound crisis.
Huge political storm, you see right-wing and isolationist sentiments surging, and this frantic, urgent push to reinforce Indo-Pacific defenses, but maybe it's too little, too late in this scenario.
In America's closest allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, Australia, they're thrown into a panic.
They start questioning the fundamental credibility of the U.S. commitment. The sources talk about a desperate arms race kicking off.
And even, chillingly, Japan potentially considering nuclear weapons. The stakes just skyrocket.
Globally, the fault lines just deepen. Europe splinters. Eastern Europe clings tighter to NATO, seeing the threat very clearly. But Western Europe, maybe disillusioned or feeling pragmatic, starts looking for more strategic independence.
And Russia. They'd likely seize the opportunity presented by all this Western disarray.
Definitely. And large parts of the global South might start shifting alignment, seeing China as the rising power, the potential new leader.
Financially, it's an earthquake for the markets. The dollar's long dominance as the global reserve currency starts to seriously waver. Confidence in U.S. leadership is shaken.
It paints a picture where the whole post-World War II liberal order fundamentally collapses. China's actively pushing its narrative. East rises, West declines. It leaves this vacuum, a post-American era.
So this first stage leaves us with a really powerful question from the source material itself. In this hypothetical, would a victory like this truly lead to China's glorious rejuvenation? Or does it actually sow the seeds for a much bigger crisis down the line? When you hear this initial phase laid out, what part of that potential fallout really hits home for you?
For me, it's how quickly that at-the-doorstep justification flips the whole script. That, coupled with the assumption of U.S. failure and the truly transformative impact of getting TSMC, it's like the perfect storm in this dark hypothetical.
Agreed. It sets a very dramatic stage. And that leads us right into stage 2, breaking the first island chain and exploring these potentially much wider expansionist ambitions.
Okay, so stage 2 assumes China didn't just stop at Taiwan. Having taken it, they've now effectively broken through the first island chain.
That critical defensive line, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines.
Exactly. So China's military power can now project directly into the wider West Pacific, potentially achieving maybe naval and air parity with the U.S. in that region. A huge shift.
And naturally, their definition of at the doorstep just expands dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about support for Taiwan anymore. Now, the entire Pacific starts to look like China's rightful sphere of influence in this view. U.S. bases in places like Okinawa, Guam, joint military exercises with allies, these are all now redefined as being at the doorstep, requiring counteraction from China.
So the big question the sources pose for this stage is, does China pause and consolidate, or does it push further out?
Right. The sources lay out two main possibilities after this hypothetical Taiwan victory. Option 1, a temporary pause.
Why would they pause?
Well, even after a win like that, there's immense work involved. They'd need to actually integrate Taiwan, especially TSMC, that crown jewel. Domestically, economically, they'd need to stabilize after a conflict. And internationally, they'd definitely face heavy Western sanctions, containment efforts. You know, groups like IOCIS or the Kyodai would be working against them.
IUCUS, Australia, UK, US, Quano, Australia, India, Japan, US, right?
So a pause would mean fortifying Taiwan's defenses, pushing the rejuvenation narrative hard at home to lock in the win, and accelerating things like RMB internationalization, trying to make their currency more global to reduce dependency on the dollar. The sources suggest this consolidation phase could maybe last, 5 to 10 years.
Okay, but what's the other option? The more aggressive one.
Option 2 is to immediately advance deeper, push right into the South and East China Seas.
What's the motivation there?
It's huge. Control over vital global shipping lanes, access to critical resources. The sources mention things like the estimated $5 trillion in trade going through the South China Sea annually. Plus, you've got long-standing territorial disputes like the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands with Japan. And after a big Taiwan win, nationalism would probably be through the roof, demanding more.
And how would they actually do this, according to the sources?
Well, things like further militarizing those artificial islands they've built in the South China Sea, increasing pressure on countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, directly challenging Japan around disputed islands, and actively trying to deter or push back any remaining U.S. military presence, like the forces based in Guam.
Which brings us to how the neighbors react. The sources describe this as incredibly tense.
For Japan, it's a crisis over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, made worse because China's military is now much closer, near places like Okinawa. The potential responses outlined for Japan are extreme. revising their pacifist constitution to allow offensive action, buying advanced jets, and yes, that possibility of considering nuclear weapons comes up again, leading to just unbelievable tension.
And the Philippines.
Their exclusive economic zone gets squeezed, potentially cuts off access to vital fishing grounds, energy resources. They'd lean heavily on their defense treaty with the U.S.
Okay.
But that reliance might be compromised by their significant economic dependence on China. It creates a really, really precarious balancing act for them.
What about Vietnam? They have disputes with China, too.
Yeah, over islands like the Parasols and Spratlys, they'd face increased conflict. Their strategy would likely be a mix: acquire more weapons, align more closely with powers like the U.S., India, Japan, but also simultaneously try to navigate relations with China using what's sometimes called bamboo diplomacy, bending but not breaking, just trying to survive between these giants.
What really comes through here, the sources, is the inherent danger of that expanding at the doorstep logic.
Exactly. By viewing U.S. bases in Okinawa or Guam as threats to their security boundary, it gives them the justification, in this hypothetical, for military action and pressure. The sources frame this principle becoming a sort of universal excuse for expansion, which would just dramatically escalate regional tension and make accidental conflict terrifyingly likely.
Yeah, it feels like a slippery slope.
It leaves us with another key question from the source material for this stage. After hypothetically taking Taiwan, does China choose caution, consolidate its gains, or does that ambition just burn unchecked towards the wider Pacific?
And critically, could the costs of that expansion and the resistance from neighbors and others ultimately drag them down?
It feels like a real crossroads in this scenario. Does the victory become a springboard, or does it become the start of getting bogged down?
Okay, let's push forward into stage 3. Thucydides' trap, great power confrontation.
Right, so now we're fast-forwarding maybe a decade or so in this hypothetical timeline. Let's say around the year 2035. In this scenario, China has successfully integrated Taiwan, they've fully leveraged TSMC's capabilities, and their power has surged significantly.
They've established control over the East and South China Seas, definitely broken through that first island chain barrier.
And their at-the-doorstep claims, well, they've now expanded across the vast Pacific Ocean. They're openly claiming U.S. bases in places like Guam and even Hawaii are now at the doorstep, and they're acting on it. Harassment with jets, Navy ships, cyber attacks.
Wow. And the sources paint this picture where U.S. credibility has pretty much collapsed after losing Taiwan. Allies are wavering, containment efforts failed.
The narrative escalation in this stage is really striking. The doorstep concept isn't just regional anymore. It stretches across the Pacific, maybe even, the sources suggest, into space. Any country seen cooperating with the U.S., Japan, South Korea, Australia, India is now viewed as a hostile provocation by China.
Even routine U.S. military exercises get labeled invasions.
Yeah. The source material explicitly states this logic is no longer defensive at all. It's become an imperial-style attempt to define global boundaries based purely on China's perceived security needs.
So what specific actions does the source suggest China might take in this 2035 scenario?
Several possibilities are listed. First, really solidifying their hold on the South China Sea. Perhaps by officially claiming the 9-dash line, that controversial U-shaped area, as their sovereign territorial waters.
Which could mean directly targeting countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, if they resist.
That's the implication. Second, using their control over key maritime choke points. The sources specifically mention straits like the Bashi Channel between Taiwan and the Philippines and the Malacca Strait.
Holding global supply chains hostage, essentially.
Potentially, yeah. Third, that ongoing harassment of Guam and Hawaii, using drones, subs, electronic warfare to disrupt U.S. operations there, and coupling that with an aggressive information war and anti-U.S. colonization narrative to justify it all.
Okay, and fourth.
Direct coercion of regional powers, pressuring Japan to halt U.S.-Japan joint exercises, demanding limits on South Korea's HAD missile defense system.
Had terminal high-altitude area defense.
Right. And the sources even mention threats of special operations if these countries refuse China's demands.
This scenario describes a fundamental transformation of the entire world order. The U.S.-based system of international law, free trade, it just crumbles.
And China actively promotes its Belt and Road Initiative, not just as infrastructure, but as framed in the sources, effectively economic colonization, creating dependent states. Countries in Africa, South America, they increasingly fall into Beijing's orbit.
And the fate of smaller states, grim, according to the sources. Myanmar, Pakistan become effectively subservient.
Japan, South Korea, the Philippines are under severe military pressure, facing potential internal instability fueled by Chinese influence campaigns.
Vietnam, though, is shown trying to maneuver, allying with India to find some sort of balance.
And the sources project this doorstep logic, continuing to expand, harassing Guam in the 2030s, actively challenging Hawaii by 2035.
And potentially pushing into the Arctic, even space, by the 2040s. It just keeps going.
It becomes a truly global concept. And this brings us squarely to that core question of the Thucydides trap, the rising power challenging the established one.
Right, often leading to conflict.
So the question posed is, will China, in this hypothetical, become the dominant power of the 21st century, displacing the U.S.? Or does it repeat that historical pattern of imperial overreach, recklessness, maybe echoing Imperial Japan's mistakes?
And in this fragmented, incredibly tense world, can the remaining states and alliances even stop this hypothetical wave? Hearing this stage, what feels like the most alarming aspect of that expansion.
For me, it's how quickly that doorstep idea just morphs from something maybe arguably defensive regionally to a justification for global reach.
It feels like a principle that just has no natural stopping point.
Exactly. Which leads us into the final and most extreme stage described. Stage 4, the reverse Cold War era, the endgame of Imperial China.
Okay, this is the peak hypothetical, maybe late 2030s, maybe later. China has achieved global hegemonic status.
They control Taiwan, the critical seas around it. The sources assume they're actively helping North Korea invade South Korea, helping Russia solidify control over Ukraine.
Showing a clear alignment against what's left of the U.S.-led order.
And they're weaponizing history here, combining the century of humiliation narrative with aggressive anti-Japan propaganda. They actively attack Japan, issue threats towards countries seen as the historical eight-nation alliance, U.S., UK, others involved in the Boxer Rebellion.
And the at-the-doorstep concept has now just exploded. It encompasses the entire planet.
Specific actions outlined are pretty dramatic. Invading Japan's Okinawa, asserting control over the Pacific, threatening the U.S. and Europe with advanced missiles, demanding a historical reckoning for past grievances, establishing this Asian peace community, which the sources bluntly call a vassal system.
And the logic behind it is just completely detached, right? Purely ideological justification.
Totally. Anti-China media in Europe, that's a thought invasion, a NASA base on Mars, a space threat, a Japan-South Korea semiconductor alliance, an act of war.
Their security boundary isn't just global. It's like anyone not under their thumb is automatically an enemy.
So how does the world respond to this hegemonic China? Extreme fragmentation and resistance. The U.S. is described as focusing solely on defending its own homeland. Europe, NATO forced into radical reorganization just to survive.
India emerges as a major counterweight, actively working against China, especially in the Indian Ocean region.
Africa largely falls under Chinese influence, while South America is just racked by internal conflict, competing influences.
Technology becomes a key battleground. Silicon Valley goes underground, establishing hidden networks.
AI gets deployed specifically to counter China's dominant narrative. The sources call it a digital guerrilla war.
And ideologically, liberal underground networks pop up in areas under Chinese sway.
Engineers, journalists, academics, people seeking freedom become digital refugees, fleeing repression.
What about inside this hypothetical imperial China?
Well, state-driven nationalism celebrates the supposed 1,000-year rise, but dissent is forced underground. And crucially, the immense pressure, the cost of maintaining this global conflict and control, it starts to fracture the ruling elite itself.
So this final stage solidifies a new kind of Iron Curtain era, but more complex, multipolar.
Yeah, the world divides into camps. The China-ordered China, Iran, pro-China African nations, the liberal underground remnants of the U.S., European refugee zones, hidden tech hubs, and shrinking neutral zones, maybe like Switzerland.
And the projected outcome is chilling.
China enjoys a period of short-term hegemony, controls the Asia-Pacific, holds the West under threat, but the sources suggest it faces massive long-term challenges, relentless economic warfare, widespread resistance, the internal strains, the external pressures that could ultimately lead to collapse.
With the terrifying possibility that collapse could involve nuclear conflict.
Yeah. Then the source injects this moment of dark humor, highlighting the hypocrisy, imagining China saying, "We are just unifying the motherland, building a lighthouse for peace."
Contrasted with the satirical counters. Oh yeah, island roofs become military ports. Missiles guarantee peace.
Or that image, I'm dancing with a knife outside your window, don't misunderstand, just practicing martial arts.
It really does underscore how absurd and dangerous that infinitely expanding at the doorstep logic becomes when taken to its absolute extreme.
And it leaves us with those ultimate fundamental questions from the sources in this final stage. Is this hypothetical future truly national rejuvenation for China? Or is it the end of a century of peace for the whole world?
If China defines the entire planet as its doorstep, who on Earth isn't eventually seen as an enemy?
Heavy questions. Will this path lead to a new, maybe fragile hegemon? Or does China's ambition cause it to self-destruct, potentially taking much of the world with it?
And can the world, in such a scenario, possibly avoid the ultimate catastrophe, nuclear war?
It's been quite a journey through this hypothetical, starting with adapting that narrative,
Escalating through expansion, confrontation.
and ending in potential global collapse.
The scenario, grim as it is, definitely forces us to consider a world fractured by conflict, living under that constant shadow of potential nuclear war.
And at the core, the sources leave us with that uncertainty. Does this path end in a difficult, fragile Chinese hegemony, or does it spiral into a broader civilizational collapse?
Ultimately, as the source material suggests, the outcome in such an extreme scenario really hinges on that interplay of ambition, the resistance it meets, and hopefully some degree of rationality prevailing against the brinkmanship.
It is definitely a lot to chew on. We've walked through a very challenging hypothetical path based on the sources provided.
And that concludes our deep dive into this potential geopolitical future. There's so much packed into this thought experiment. What aspects of this complex hypothetical scenario really stand out to you, the listener, right now?
Look, we love getting into the weeds on this stuff, but we also like to keep it real and hopefully enjoyable for you. So if you're digging these deep dives and want more of our slightly less formal takes.
Our caffeinated analysis.
Yeah. Be sure to hit subscribe for Sip and Talk right here on your podcast app.
And hey, since we're all about sharing the love, you should also definitely go check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. Seriously entertaining stuff happening over there.
Yeah, Micky's great. You won't regret it.